Okay, so today we're going to be looking at startup challenges. What does it look like to have a roadmap to success? What does the global medical device market look like? Regulatory essentials, and then we'll start looking at the medical device development process. So historically, some people think that medical devices are a very new intervention, but they're not really. They've basically been around for millennia in different forms. So we can go back to the ancient Egyptians. We can look at flint tip drills in primitive times. These were all forms of medical devices, but in the most primitive form. Um, it wasn't until as late as the 1960s and the 1970s when the United States introduced the medical device amendments for safety and effectiveness, and also as late as 1993 before we had formal regulations in Europe under the medical device directives to present day, where in 2017, in more recent times, we've had a whole reform of medical device regulations for Europe. And I'll also talk a little bit about the UK medical device regulations, which are currently also going through a reform and set for various timelines. I put this together just lots of people might be familiar, or some people might be familiar with medical device in media. Specifically, these two documentaries are quite interesting. The Dropout, some people might be familiar with the Theranos case with Elizabeth Holmes. She was imprisoned and sentenced, I believe, a 9-year sentence or maybe longer than that, and sued for falsifying medical device claims and medical device evidence, which was not really there. So the device was looking at in vitro diagnostics and falsified the device in itself. So this was a docu-series which pointed out some of the bad side of medical device development and what not to do. And then The Bleeding Edge, also very interesting, a Netflix documentary, which some of you may have seen, and if not, I would recommend it. It shows you again the wrongs of the medical device industry. And also, usually what I would do is play a short video, which I didn't feel it was appropriate for this format, but the short video you can find out it's about the European Parliament introducing the new medical device regulations in 2017. And this was after the PIP scandal with breast implants, where the manufacturer PIP in France was using industrial grade silicon for human use. And again, there was falsifications on the supplier information, and also the notified body was also in trouble for certifying that product for use, for human use. And then there's been lots of other cases like the metal on metal hip implants and various other devices which have been continuously available in the market without any or insufficient clinical evidence. So this has happened a number of times, and it's exposed the medical devices industry, where there's always many more cases in the pharmaceutical industry, but also in the medical device industry, where everything is aimed for patient safety and ensuring risk is as low as possible with medical devices. So the question here is, if you have a medical device to launch, there's going to be lots of technological challenges, there's regulatory requirements. We really have to have a look at the device definitions of what a medical device actually is. So this question often comes whether the medical device is in fact a wellness or well-being device, because some devices which do not have clinical claims, they may not actually be a medical device. So it's then in the intended purpose, which outlines whether the device in fact needs to undergo the medical device regulations and directives, or if it's going to then undergo a different route of conformity, which may be for consumer use. It might be under the electrical directives. It could be for other consumer products, etc. And so there's a whole number of other things. So with a wellness device, what's intended for general wellness, which presents a low risk to the users and others, For example, a device that promotes healthy weight or encourages healthy eating, that could be considered wellness. And then a medical device which clearly is intended to treat or diagnose a condition is subject to medical device regulations. For example, a device that claims to treat or diagnose obesity is considered a medical device. So that's just a example. We'll look at this in a lot more detail in the coming slides, and we'll explore the medical device definitions in the different jurisdictions, which is also very, very important. So there can be a number of things that can change a wellness device into a medical device also. So that's also very important. And that's also going to come from the intended use or the intended purpose. So according to the FDA, the definition of a medical device is, I won't read the whole lot, but the first paragraph, if I just read that, which is an instrument, an apparatus, implement, machine, contrivance, implant, in vitro agent, or other similar or related article, including a component, part, or accessory, which is, and then it goes into the following, which then talks about intended for use in the diagnosis of disease, conditions, etc., etc. One point that I would like to point out here is in the definition, it talks about these different conditions in man or other animals. And it also then talks about intended to affect the structure of any function of the body of man or other animals. And then it can also, again, in the last paragraph, also talks about or other animals. So it's if you have a device which is for veterinary purposes, it can also come under the definition of medical device in the US. And this is where we'll look at the definition in Europe, which differs. So there's no other animals or animals mentioned in the definition for the European medical device. But similarly, or probably more explicitly, the medical device definition talks about an instrument, apparatus, appliance, software, implant, reagent, material, other article intended by the manufacturer to be used alone or in combination for human beings for one or more of the following specific medical purposes: diagnosis, prevention, monitoring, prediction, prognosis, treatment, or alleviation of disease. And then the same or compensation for an injury or disability, and then investigation, replacement, of modification of the anatomy or physiological, pathological process, etc. And then providing information also by means of in vitro examination of specimens, because we're going to then look at the differences again with traditional medical devices and then also in vitro diagnostics, which also have slightly different roots, but they are very strong overlaps. Typically, both are medical devices. That's the overarching definition of in vitro diagnostics, because it comes under this definition. But also then traditional medical devices then take a slightly different route with its different requirements depending on the device. So we'll have a look at that. So before we look at that, we will also have a look at the UK medical device definition. It's very similar to the European device definition. So this is according to the UK MDR 2002, which also then talks about similarly for diagnosis, prevention, monitoring, treatment, or alleviation of disease, etc., etc. But the important thing is when we look at the rules, because once the very first thing we have to do is actually identify whether a device that we're thinking about or looking at is in fact a medical device or not. And the moment that we've decided that this is a medical device because it fits the definition, that's when we will look at the root of conformity, and we will then begin to look at the classification of the device, which will also be appropriate to risk of the device itself. So as I mentioned, the intended use is very, very important, and I cannot emphasize this enough. To begin the journey of your medical device development with your intended use statement. And I call this an intended use statement because it's much broader than just the intended purpose. So we could have a look at the medical purpose, we have a look at the user population, the age, the weight, the sex, the health condition, what specimens are required as input to the medical device, to then give it the related output, what the user profile might be, what training is needed, what experience is needed. So this could be a layperson, could be home use, it could be a clinician, it could be in a clinical environment. So we look here at the application environment, the frequency of use. It might be a single-use medical device. It could be a device that's designed to be used multiple times. The location, if it's needing to be in a specific location, if it needs to be installed, or if it's the mobility, if it's portable, a portable device, is it handheld? All these factors constitute the intended use statement. And then what foreseeable misuse? What's the worst thing that could go wrong? Are we looking at death by misuse of the device, or are we looking at possibly just some inconvenience or trauma, anxiety, stress, those type of things? Annex A ISO 24971 will also help you in the intended use statement. There's a series of questions which are asked for about the characteristics of the device, which will then help you formulate this intended use statement. And then last but not least, the clinical claims. What claims are you making that makes your device a medical device? Because anything that fits the definition of the medical device will have a clinical benefit and will have some form of claims that you are looking to make, and those then need to be validated. So this is all very, very important. So this is really looking at the foundations and the the basic form of what the medical device journey is going to look like, sorry. So then the roadmap to success is beginning to understand the market and the need. What is the market like? What's the market size? What market are you entering? What is the device objectives? Is there really a need, or is the market already saturated with similar devices? Then looking at business plan and funding, grant writing. What do you need? How much do you need? When do you need it? All these type of things. Now, recently I've been writing on various social media platforms about the race for medical device technology, because one of the key things about launching a medical device into the market is ensuring that you've got adequate funding to be able to allow you that success to market entry. Because very often what happens is there are far more medical devices that don't make it to market than do. And very often it's because of lack of funding. Along the timeline, there's a race involved here of a specific medical device technological advancement that somebody is trying to get to the market, and then there are others also trying to do the same thing, and whoever gets there first will win and succeed, and then it becomes very, very competitive, and this happens very, very commonly. So interesting to look at the market size from 2023 to 2034 over the next 10 years or so. The current market size is sitting at 640 or 678, almost $680 billion. And that's said to then, in the next 10 years or so, to then go over $1 trillion. So that's a very significant market to be entering. And obviously we can have a look at the global market share by region, and we can see quite quickly that North America captures nearly 50% of the global market share, which is quite obviously why medical device developers would like to then enter the US market for their first and primary market, also because of private healthcare. And then also because regulations are more stable in the US than they have been in Europe. Because we have a look at the pie chart, and we can quite quickly also see that Europe is the next big stake in the market of 30%, and then following the other markets, 24%, 4%, and 2% are followed by Latin America, Middle East, and Africa, and the rest of the world. And these are growing markets for sure. So the Middle East also, and Africa, Latin America, these are growing markets. The Asia Pacific market these are growing markets. So if we look at that together, we're looking at 30% of the rest of the world, aside from Europe and the US, is also a very interesting market to look at for that overall global market share. So if we look at the European medical device market by country, then we also then can see that Germany is leading in terms of by country by 26.5% of the European market share. So it's interesting to then see that globally, the US and then Europe would be the prime markets to look at if you are developing a medical device. And then by country within Europe, Germany, France, Italy, UK, and Spain, these are the first 5 countries that have that market share. So these are significant markets to look at when we're looking at the UK and Europe. So then again, as I mentioned earlier on, I talked about medical devices and in vitro diagnostics, and we will look at this in a bit further detail in the coming slides. But you can see, I'm sure it's quite easy to guess what that acceleration here was for in vitro diagnostics from 2019 to 2021. If I was asking people to put their hand up, then I think people can probably guess it was the pandemic during that time, where there were lots of things like lateral flow test kits that would come under in vitro diagnostics. Not vaccines, because that's governed under the pharmaceutical directives, but lateral flow test kits and other associated medical devices. PPEs would not come under that. People were also asking me about the regulations during the pandemic period. That was also an exceptional period where there was an emergency use authorization for the regulations, where the pathway to market was expedited due to the emergency. So you can see the growth rate for traditional medical devices and then also for in vitro diagnostics over that period. So when we look at regulatory essentials that need to be considered, so the regulatory framework, the way it works is in the United States, we've got the US FDA. In Europe, we have the European Union, which regulates the market via specific notified bodies which are designated. So this is one of the key differences between the US and Europe, where the US market is governed by the federal agents, which are authorized by the US government. So the US FDA would regulate the medical devices, whereas in Europe, it's been delegated to individual organizations, which are called notified bodies, and they are the ones that are responsible for certifying individual legal manufacturers with CE certificates. In the UK, we also have something similar to Europe, where MHRA, which is the government agency, then the competent authority, would then regulate medical devices and designate specific companies, which are notified bodies, to then provide UKCA marking. So that's one of the differences. So when we look at device classification in the regulatory pathway, each market has got its own classification systems, and we will look at that in the coming slides. We have to determine the appropriate device classification, which is based on risk. That's very, very critical, and which we'll have a look at. The classification dictates the level of regulatory scrutiny and the approval process. The regulatory requirements in the US differ from those in Europe, although there's a very strong overlap and the submission process is different. So if we look at the US FDA classification system, there are 3 classifications: Class 1, Class 2, and Class 3. And similar to any other classification, whether it's Europe, UK, and even the rest of the world, principally, it will work on the same principles. The lower number is a lower risk, and the higher number is a higher risk classification. And then in order to get market clearance, you've got different pathways. So for you in the US, for example, we have 510Ks, which is the most common method for approval, but you also have the possibility of exemption depending on, again, the low risk nature of the device, which can then come under an exemption, which we also have something similar in Europe and UK, which is called self-certification, which we'll also talk about in a second. But then if the 510K is based on the fact that there are predicate devices, which are competitive devices already on the market, which have similar nature claims, similar functionality, and they're very similar devices. So you try to make a claim. So this is something that's allowed and quite common in the industry, that somebody's already gone through a lot of the hard work and they might have done all the clinical trials. They then got their device on the market. It's been in the market for years. And then you're bringing a device which is quite similar in nature, and you can look up these predicate devices on the FDA database. Um, and you can search and find predicate devices, and you can also find lots of substantial information about the original submission that was made at the time, and you can see the claims that were made, and you can compare it against your intended use to try to tweak your intended use to make sure that it can become a 510K and become exempt. Sorry, not exempt, but it becomes equivalent to a device. So that's the easiest path. And then we can also then look at the general controls and special controls in clinical data, which might require PMA approval, which is the hardest route to market when there is then clinical trials that are needed. And that can be a very expensive and lengthy task. So this is one to avoid if you can, but if you have a device which is of a high class nature, that's the route that you're going to have to take. Some economic considerations that you need to also note. It can be also very timely and expensive, depending on the classification of your device. These are all only a rule of thumb, but it's always important to have a look at the FDA website to look at up-to-date timelines for responses from the FDA. So as I said, for CE marking, we've got a similar low risk and high risk nature for classification, where class 1 is the lowest risk. But then what differs here is that we've got 4 classifications. Within class 2, we then break it down to class 2A and then class 2B and then class 3. So you can see some of the examples here that's mentioned, and I'll let you just have a look at some of these examples. So you can see below this dotted line, it talks about self-assessment. So that's you can self-assessment, self-declared, or self-certification. You can use different names for it, but ultimately what it means is that there is no requirement for a notified body to intervene in your device unless the class 1 device is sterile, if it has a measuring function, or is reusable. If there's any of those three, then what the way that it works is that the classification then has a suffix. It's class 1S, class 1M, class 1R. And if it's neither of those, if it's just a traditional class 1, that's when it can become self-declared or self-assessed. And then if not, then we can see some of the other examples of class 2A, class 2B, and class 3. And then on the right-hand side, you can see also examples for in vitro diagnostics, where there are 4 classifications, class A, B, C, and D. And in class A, which these are some of the examples like specimen receptacles and media and clinical chemistry analyzers, where they can become class A. Anything above that could be a B, C, or a D. And then we also have to follow the rules. So each of these have got different rules. The current situation with EU, I think that's a slightly older figure, but we have a few more notified bodies than that. But it's a big challenge at the moment with availability and capacity from notified bodies because they're very busy at the moment transitioning anyone that's already been legally certified with an old CE certificate from under the MDD, and they're transitioning to the new MDR. To give you a statistic, from last year, there were only about 10% of the entire certificates which were issued under the old MDD, which had been transferred to the new MDR. And I believe the figure was almost 20,000 certificates which need to be transferred from the old medical device directive to the new medical device regulations. That's a significant burden for the notified bodies. And it's the reason why the timelines are so long for transition, because they're completely inundated with this backlog of work that they're working on at the moment. And many of these notified bodies are not even taking on new clients, which is a bit of a problem. So this is one of the reasons why many development companies have now started to look towards the US as a possible more viable option, where there is much more stability with the regulations, and there's more certainty with the regulations. So that's one of the big challenges with the European medical device regulation. So what about UK? you might be thinking, so we're obviously post-Brexit. We're also then looking to make our own regulatory framework, which is at the moment we have simply adopted the old medical device directives from Europe, which are a slightly less stringent directive or regulation than the new medical device regulations for Europe, which makes things slightly easier for anyone that wants to launch a device in the UK. And my advice always is, at the moment, while the regulations for the UK are slightly easier, it might be a good starting point to enter the market in the UK or the US, and then look towards European CE marking, if that's financially, economically viable for your business ideas and commercial success. So the roadmap is the regulatory reform is changing. So there's the regulatory changes in the UK framework. This is the current timeline. It's a living document, but this was released in December last year, so it's not very old. So as it stands, we've got a timeline for around June 25 for regulations for post-market surveillance to come into effect. The draft came out for the post-market surveillance late last year, and then pre-market requirements for new regulations will be some point in 2026 where this will be formalized. At the moment, this is being drafted, so there's lots of surveys that have been taken from the UK government from public consultation of what that needs to look like. But my guess is that it's going to start looking more like the European medical device regulations, but where there's been some severe mistakes that have been made within the European medical device regulation, that's something that we do not want to repeat. Well, sorry, we're just halfway through the presentation at the moment. I forgot to mention, if anyone has any questions, there is a Q&A chat box. Please feel free to drop in any questions into the Q&A, and we can have a look at that, hopefully 5 to 10 minutes before we close. So this is what the regulatory roadmap looks like. So also with software, including AI and digital mental health products, there's also a timeline for the mid of this year before some of these policies and regulations are formulated. So now we're going to look at medical device development. So when you are developing a new medical device, typically we would look at a phase-by-phase stage gate review. And this is just done as any good project management would have milestones and stage gate review. So in this case, we have an example where phase one would be initiation, opportunity, and risk analysis. So that's when you're looking at the market analysis, competitive assessment. You're looking at your competitors, whether you're looking at there's actually a market need for what you're trying to develop. You've done some figures, you've looked at the market, and you've looked at the regulatory requirements. At this point, it's also good to have a regulatory roadmap. So I talked about regulatory roadmap in a lot of detail in a podcast with Greenlight Guru. So if you're interested to know what a regulatory roadmap would look like, please feel free to have a look at Greenlight Guru's website. If you just type in regulatory roadmap, Greenlight Guru, I'm sure that will come up. Podcast which was done not long ago. And then we then look at phase two, when we're looking at conceptualizing the idea, feasibility, prototype analysis, some early risk management, some preclinical trials, and then we move into phase three, when we then really get into the weeds of verification and validation testing. And then we look at stress testing the device and the prototype before we then look at final validation. And then that's at this point, we're really looking at finalizing the medical device technical dossier to make sure that we've got all the evidence that we need to make sure that the device has completed all of the regulatory requirements and is ready for submission. And then phase five is basically keeping everything alive. And so this is a cyclical process. So it's not to think about medical device development as a linear process where it finishes and terminates at the point of medical device launch. It's completely live, and it must continue as long as the device is living and is active, and only upon the time where the device is terminated and maybe even ceased from existing. That's at that point, you have no obligations. But as long as the device is, you should still have, there are obligations that you also have documentation within your quality management system. That you also have adherence to ISO 13485, which is the basic medical devices quality management system requirement. And you also have to then be responsible for post-market surveillance, anything like feedback, customer complaints, that needs to be looked at. And we'll also talk about this in a bit more detail now. So when you get to phase one, so it's good to have a quality management system at this point. So I mentioned ISO 13485. It's a really good base to have to build upon. If you have a structure in place, which is ultimately, these are procedures, they're forms, they're templates, they are your rule book for your device organization of how you will do things. It will allow you to lock down and control your activities also. And then that's a really good base to have to make sure that you're following everything. It's been devised over years. ISO 13485 is in existence for a very long time. The recent revision was 2016. It will be revised again probably in the next year or so. There's been talk about it being revised in 2026. There was an addendum that came out in 2021, which was specifically to align it to the European medical device requirement, so the EUR MDR 2017745 and the IVDR 746. There are some specific annexes which are added on to the 2021 revision of ISO 13485, which then makes sure that you're also aligned to the European regulations. So then when we're looking at the formulation, concept and feasibility, that's when you have a working device. You might need funding at that point for prototyping and trialing your device, start thinking about risks, and then moving into conceptualizing and then verification and validation. Making sure that you've got customer requirements. Have you followed through the customer requirements? Do you have a traceability matrix? Look at the verification and validation needs. Look at what it needs for withstanding the real world pressures. You might need to have some things that you're looking at which are outsourced. You need to consider about what test equipment you need also in-house if you're going to test it. Otherwise, all your activities might be outsourced. You might need to have a subcontractor manufacturer in place. Then you need to have supplier verification controls in place also. And risk management, which forms the basic principle of an underlying base of all good medical device development, is looking at risk management. So what potential failures do you have from a manufacturing process, from user failures, design failures? These are all things that we need to look at, what potentially might go wrong. This is all part of risk management, which we'll have a look at in the next slide. This diagram here that we've got here is a typical waterfall diagram, which looks at your user needs, design inputs, outputs, then looking at verification and validation. And at each of these stages, we should have a design review meeting. And we need to make sure that we've also achieved design freeze so that we're not changing the design up until a certain point, that we've frozen the design, and then we will then look at clinical use, and then also look at usability studies as well. You might need to have ethical approval and ethics committee, and you might need to also run specific clinical trials. Again, that's if your evaluation doesn't allow you to have equivalence. So moving on to risk management, as I mentioned earlier on, that's a fundamental core part of your medical device development process. So you begin with your risk analysis, start thinking about identifying hazards, think about harms. Think about a harms list, create a harms list. What is the worst thing that can go wrong? And then list out all of the different harms that could be impacted. We look at the severity, so the official definition of medical device risk is looking at anything that's patient harm, anything that's damage to property, and also damage to the environment. Those can be anything that you need to look at for risk. Think about a risk evaluation, risk controls, what risk controls you'll put in to mitigate the risks. And then once you've put in the risk controls and mitigated everything to the best of your ability, what risk is left? What's the residual risk? Then you have to write a risk benefit risk analysis And then also remember that risk management is a living exercise. It does not finish until the device is active and on the market. So some of the things that you might to think about in terms of validation and testing, which might become mitigation controls in risk, could be biocompatibility. So biocompatibility, the standard that's used in the industry is ISO 10993 and also FDA guidance. So you have to have a look at things like if the device is in patient contact, if it's in contact with skin or tissue, is it possible that there might be some cytotoxicity, sensitization, implantation, genotoxicity, carcinogenity, reproductive toxicity, developmental toxicity, and degradation? So these are assessments that you need to make. And it could be because there's direct impact or even the indirect impact in the human body. So we look at the flow chart, which we start off with biocompatibility. We really need to have a look at how does the device contact the body directly or indirectly. We can also have a look at the materials to see if there's already material that's being used, which is FDA approved or is already used for human use or has been used in medical devices. So these are very important things to have a look at, which they can reduce the burden, the workload that needs to be done. But ultimately, you need to have a look at the toxicological effects of any materials that are used in biocompatibility. And then you may be able to write a justification, or you might need to have specific tests done, especially if you've got novel materials to meet those requirements. So the methodology that you would have is write a biological evaluation plan. This, again, no surprises, is identified by risk. So again, you should do a risk assessment, or in your risk assessment, you would identify biological risks. You would then look at the biological evaluation that you might need to mitigate those risks through testing. So you might need to actually do in vivo testing or in vitro testing in animals, in vivo, or even in human use, to try and justify that the materials that are being used are safe for use. And any testing that you're doing ideally should be done in laboratories which are accredited. So once you've got all of the results, then you would then evaluate the results and then write up a biological evaluation report. If you've got a device which has got is run by electrical requirements or battery, then you also need to look at the electrical safety. IEC 60601-1. There's many subsets of this which you need to have a look at. Things like EMC testing, also ingress IP rating, and a number of other tests that you need to have a look at for medical electrical safety. So that's another thing to think about. And then the symbols that are also you need to put on packaging or in the instructions for use or manuals. They also differ from the traditional requirements. So the ISO 15223 standard is the governing standard for medical device symbols. But then if you've got electrical safety, then you need to consider these other symbols in addition. So you also have a look at the procedure, the test labs, the risk again. So also again looking at risk management. ISO 14971 is the risk management standard that you need to consider having a look at. So everything risk management would be governed by ISO 14971. If your device is a physical device and not a software medical device, then you need to consider stability in packaging. So there's things like shelf life, storage condition, packaging integrity. You might need to have a look at the sterility. If the product is sterile, you need to make sure that after the shelf life, that the device is still sterile and maintains its sterility. Storage conditions, you need to have a look at also, and also transportation. So things like acceptability, accelerated stability testing is one way of doing it. So if you have a specific timeline or shelf life of, say, 5 years, you would do a real-time stability test, where then the test would be done at periodical intervals that the device would be removed from a chamber and then tested for its functionality and its integrity on those intervals. But then also you can do an accelerated stability test, which would then, using a formula, you can accelerate that 5 years to several months. So you would also then do accelerated stability testing. As I said, if you've got a sterile device, even non-sterile device, this is actually good practice to do, just to check to see if there's any bubble emission, dye penetration, seal peel, strength test, and burst strength. This is definitely very important if you've got a sterile device with sterile packaging, which may be ETO sterile or gamma radiation. One of the webinars that we did before Christmas, where we looked at packaging validation, looks at this in a lot more detail. We looked at all of the different standards and the requirements that are needed. And then transportation testing. How safe is your device in transit? There are specific standards required, ASTM standards D4169, and then the subset, and then ISTA levels of testing, where you would then expose the device and the packaging to compression testing or drop testing or vibration testing, and then also environmental conditioning, that the device's packaging withstands all the pressures once it's been through all of those simulated tests. Then we look at usability, which is also very, very important. So the usability of the device, we need to also then conform to IEC 62366, and then also FDA guidance for human factors. You might need to perform formative evaluation or summative evaluation or both, and that's to attain feedback. What are the users like? You need to prepare a use specification. What can go wrong with regards to the safety and the user interface? If you need to identify any characteristics, again, this should be identified in your risk analysis. So you would identify user risks. Which of those things should we evaluate at the end? Look at the hazards that are coming from the usability and the user interface. What's really useful to do is when you have a use risk analysis that you're developing, is think about doing a step-by-step user flow diagram, which then breaks down the use of the device in stages. So that could be open up the packaging, remove the device from the packaging, remove the secondary packaging, take the device out of the secondary packaging, switch the device on, etc., right up until the termination of the device's usage. And then you can then determine all of the different risks associated with the device at those stages. So it's really important to look at the whole process of usability, and you might need to do formative or summative evaluation. So clinical trials, we always try to avoid clinical trials if possible. Clinical evaluation is the main area that we need to have a look at, which is the overarching exercise. And within clinical evaluation, there's three ways that we can determine our data. Number one is to look at literature. And if there's any literature that's available already in the field, we then try to see and justify the clinical evidence by literature studies. Number two, we would then look at bench testing to see if there's any bench testing that we might need to do, and we can compare a device that's already on the market with our device and then record the results that way, which is then viable data. And then the last method is clinical trials, where then you would have to then undergo the testing with human participants. If it's class 3 and class 2B implantables, then you need to undergo the clinical investigations, and then you need to follow ISO 14155 and then also 20916 for in vitro medical devices, in vitro diagnostics. In the US, you also need to follow the IDE exemption path and possible the PMA process. So this is the clinical trials regulatory pathway for EU. If you have a medical device which is CE marked or not CE marked or yet to be CE marked, then you need to look at the investigations. Again, as I emphasized right at the beginning, look at the intended purpose. what's not within the intended purpose. If you can simplify your claims and simplify your medical device, that's always a good strategy to use. Now, the other thing that you can also do is if you had a device which had very extensive clinical claims, which makes your device a very novel device where there's no existing devices on the market, it's also possible to bring your device claims back, try to simplify your device only to just to get your device into the market with a simple intended purpose. This will allow you to enter the medical devices market and gain experience, and then you can also then use that to gain clinical data while the device is being used, and then that can be used in your post-market clinical follow-up. And that can also then aid your device for other submissions. So let's say, for example, you use that for UKCA marking and you launch your device in the UK, you can then use that data that you have from UK clinical use for your studies for your EU submission, which is a much, much harder submission than the UK requirements. So think about pre-market, preclinical pilot and pivotal studies. Think about the requirements, the descriptors, whether there's a burden to human subject, whether it's interventional or non-interventional, then your post-market surveillance. You then also need to have a look at PMCF, look at your case studies, look at continuous studies after the device has already been on the market. That's also really important. Now, I'm just going to talk about software validation. I only have a few minutes left, so I'll try and be as quickly as possible. With software validation, you need to follow 62304. Look at also the FDA guidance, general principles of software validation. The EU MDR Annex 1 requires specific requirements for software validation. The V model is always a good model to have a look at for software validation. Look at your user needs, look at software requirement specification, look at developing your design, and look at your detailed design. The software code needs to be tested. We need to verify and validate the testing, and we need to follow 62304. There's 3 classifications of software itself. Class A, which basically means that there's no possible damage to health. Class B would be if you've got some risk to the patient that might end up with non-serious injury, but then if you have the possibility of death or serious injury, it's going to end up into the higher risk classification of software medical device. Think about then also the type of documents you need to think about if you have software, user needs, systems, architecture, software architecture, components, requirements, detailed design, traceability, and then all of the testing and risk management. And then finally, just moving on to the final points, if you've got to this point now, then you should basically have a validated and verified device. If you've got no evidence, then you can't make the claim. Any claims that you're making, whether it's marketing materials, whether it's on website, or anything that's in the public domain, will be challenged by regulatory authorities. You need to make sure that you gather all the evidence for testing, complete the documentation, and then submit it to the regulatory authorities for the final approvals. So then when you've got the final review, as we said earlier on, you have to make sure that when the technical documentation is complete and it's current, do you need to retest? Are your post-market plans in place? Do you have a system for capturing complaints and feedback? Have you finalized packaging and labeling? So they're also any symbol that you put on packaging and labeling, just remember this, that they are also mitigation controls, that they are there for a purpose. And then you also need to look at, do you have to then have any significant changes? You need to make sure that in Europe, you have to report those significant changes to the competent authorities and inform them that you've now made a change to your device. And then the technical documentation might also need to be changed. Think about vigilance. Always make sure that you've got a robust system in place that can handle anything for post-market and recalls. Don't cut any corners, follow your QMS procedures, adhere towards good manufacturing practice, follow your feedback and complaint system, and then always update your technical documentation as required. Make sure that you're adequately resourced, and then continue to improve your medical device design. So in summary, Medical devices can be very financially rewarding and a solution to complex everyday health challenges, but by no means should it be rushed and should always follow the regulations and standards. And if you follow the correct path, hopefully you'll get your device to market safely and successfully, and we won't have any of these disaster stories that we were discussing earlier on. So I'd just like to stop here and just see if there's any questions, or if anybody needs any clarification, you can put it into the Q&A box. I'll give it a couple of minutes. And if anybody wants to put the hand up, they can also do that as well. There might be possible questions that we can